So the second talk is Bridging the Gap Between the Genitals and the Mind, and Marguerite de Witt is from Maastricht, who's going to talk about this.
Okay, good morning. I'm going to present some studies on the underlying mechanisms that can explain the impact of mindfulness on sexual arousal, so we can sort of bridge the gap between the mind and the body. Now, sexual arousal can be considered as the primary outcome variable in sex research, but it's also quite complex to study sexual arousal because it is experienced through different responses. We have a cognitive component, physical component, and these do not necessarily converge. So, what is important for sexual arousal to unfold? Well, first of all, there has to be an adequate sexual stimulus that will automatically grab our attention and that will then automatically be praised as sexually meaningful. This will then automatically evoke sexual arousal responses, and the moment we become aware of these ongoing physical responses, we will further elaborate on the sexual stimulus, we will maintain our attention on it, and this will then result in subjective arousal, this actual sexual desire, which is then the result of these ongoing physical responses. And so this will then trigger the motivation to actually engage into sexual activity. So when putting these different steps into a model, it seems that especially attention here plays an important role, but also appraisal processes, so how we evaluate the sexual stimuli. And what also is important is that we make this distinction between subjective arousal and genital arousal. Now, we know that agreement between subjective and genital arousal is important because stronger feedback links between the cognitive and physical components of the sexual system will increase sexual arousability. Now, we know that men generally show high concordance between their subjective feelings of arousal and their genital responses because they have these peripheral feedback processes. They have external genitals, so they can benefit from this. They know I have an erection, so I must be sexually aroused. But women benefit less from these feedback processes because their genital response does not produce a prominent cue. Lubrication is not clearly observable. And so this may explain why women are generally characterized by lower sexual arousability. So in a way, it could be that to increase their arousability, we should increase their awareness of genital responses. We also know that a lot of sexual dysfunctions are rooted in sexual arousal problems. Often sexual arousal, lack of sexual arousal is the core problem in sexual dysfunctions, which is characterized by deficient feedback between their subjective and genital arousal responses. So to sum up, I think that sexual arousability is determined by, first of all, an adequate sexual stimulus, attention, awareness of these physical arousal responses, and the feedback process between subjective and genital arousal. So if we want to increase sexual arousability, we have to focus on these specific components in our therapies. But when we look at treatments, the most common treatment for sexual arousal problems is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more about cognitive restructuring, targeting avoidance behavior, using sensitive focus exercises, and so on. And when we look at treatment of female sexual arousal problems, what we often see is that they take this low concordance between subjective and genital arousal as the norm. So most treatments don't focus on the genital awareness in women, but focus on this cognitive restructuring, on the subjective arousal, without actually trying to increase genital awareness or increasing the concordance between subjective and genital arousal. Now, although we know that these CBT treatments are highly effective for sexual problems, we do know that the third wave of CBT protocols focus more on mindfulness and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And while these treatments have become increasingly popular because they have been demonstrated to be highly effective for a range of clinical conditions, it has its roots in Buddhist meditation, and the basic idea of mindfulness is to focus our attention on bodily sensations, which then cultivates this non-judgmental, moment-to-moment awareness. Now, there is growing evidence now that these mindfulness-based treatments are highly effective for sexual problems. So it seems that it increases sexual desire, it decreases sexual distress, there's more interoceptive awareness, more attention to sexual stimuli, more quality of life. So it seems to be a good thing. But when we take a closer look at the evidence, it seems that there's often no control condition. There's like a pre- and post-measurement, and if there is a control condition, it's not an active control condition. So we cannot be sure what the specific effect is of mindfulness over and above the general effect of an active intervention. It's also often directed towards a specific clinical condition like endometriosis or cancer. So we still don't know much about the basic operating mechanism of mindfulness in a non-clinical sexual context. And what also is remarkable is that mindfulness is often part of a larger therapy. It's often integrated in CBT protocols, so we cannot really know what role, if any, was played by specific mindfulness interventions. So I think we need to conduct more research on these mindfulness-based only interventions to know more about the effect of mindfulness on sexual arousal. So what are these mechanisms of change here? Well, mindfulness is mainly about attention. It's regulating our attention on our bodily signals instead of these distracting thoughts. Now, this is exactly what the body scan is. Body scan means that people lay down on the ground, they scan different parts of their body, and they focus on their body, and when there are distracting thoughts, they just let go and focus on their body again. Mindfulness is also about accepting what you feel without self-judgment, without negative thoughts or negative appraisals. So when we translate this to the context of sexuality, it actually makes sense that mindfulness is a good treatment for sexual arousal problems because it targets the core determinants of sexual arousal. It's about attention to the sexual stimuli, it's about attention to your body, which is exactly the body scan and which is closely related to sensate focus exercises, and it's also about accepting your feelings without self-judgment. So in some studies, what I wanted to do is look at the effect of the body scan and acceptance on attention to sexual stimuli and sexual arousal. So I'm going to present 4 studies. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just going to highlight the main idea. So 2 studies on the effect of body scan, 2 on acceptance, in which we look at mood, sexual arousal, the subjective arousal, but also genital arousal and attention to sexual stimuli. Now, I did these studies in women because especially women are characterized by these low awareness of genital arousal and low concordance. But I guess it makes sense to do this in men as well because they can also benefit from this awareness process. So what I do is I invited women to come to the lab and they watch a sexual movie, and while watching the movie they have to report on their sexual arousal. So they have this lever and then they have to indicate how much sexual arousal did you feel, and also which genital sensations did you feel during the sexual film clip. And we also measured their genital arousal using the plethysmograph, the VPA measure. To measure attention to sexual stimuli, we use the computer task. So we present pictures, sexual pictures, which are then replaced by a target, and participants have to respond at the location of the target. So when it's in the upper location, they have to press right, and in the lower location, they have to press left. And so when the target appears at the same location of the picture, participants can react quickly because their attention was on the picture. But when it appears at the opposite location, they have to shift their attention, and this costs time. So the reaction times at this target give us information on how much attention participants are paying to these sexual pictures. Now, in this first first study we did, half of the participants did the body scan training. So they came to the lab, they report on their basic mood, then they lay on the ground and we do this audio tape of 15 minutes, a body scan, then they report on mood again, then they watch a neutral movie, which was a documentary, they report on sexual arousal, then they watch a sexual movie, it was a female-oriented porn movie, then they report on sexual arousal again, and then they perform the attentional task. And in the control condition, they just listened to an audio tape on the history of Europe. So what we see here, there was no improvement in mood, but mood scores were already quite high at the baseline. And what we see is that in the body scan condition, participants do respond with more genital arousal in compared to control. And we also see that women pay more attention to the sexual stimuli in the body scan condition compared to control. Now, we conducted the second study because a body scan is something you have to train. So we invited participants to come to the lab, and then they trained this body scan exercise during 1 week every evening, and then they came back to the lab again. So we wanted to include a pre-post measurement of attention and arousal so that we have something to compare with. We also had an active control condition so that participants really had to do something. So they listened to presentation on healthy lifestyles instead of the body scan. And then every night during 1 week, they received an article via email on healthy lifestyles. They had to summarize this and send it back to the experiment leaders, so they were actually doing something. And we also measured genital arousal with the VPA. Again, we found that in the body scan, after this training, participants respond with more genital arousal, and we did not find this improvement in the control condition, and again, more attention to sexual stimuli. And after the body scan training, there was no effect on actual physical arousal responses. We did a third study on acceptance. So what we did here is that participants read an essay of 3 pages on acceptance of sexual emotions, and they had to apply this while watching the sexual film clip. So we did the same protocol, but now instead of the body scan, they just read something like, accept your feelings. It's important that you just accept what you're feeling. Don't try to suppress it. Don't try to distract yourself. Just feel what you feel. It's okay. In the other condition, participants had a suppression instruction. So then half of the participants received the instruction something like, try to suppress your feelings. If you feel something sexually, just distract yourself. It's important to know how much control you can have over your sexual emotions. And then in the control condition, they just wrote on a typical Tuesday. What we found here is that participants reported with more arousal in the acceptance condition compared to suppression and control. We found no effect on attention, but this time we did find that in the suppression condition, participants reported more attention to sexual stimuli, which could be a rebound effect. If you're told to suppress your sexual emotions, you actually pay more attention to it. We did a fourth study replicating this. We also included genital arousal here. And what we see is that in the acceptance condition, participants report more sexual arousal, and they also show more genital arousal with the VPA. We also found stronger concordance between subjective and genital arousal in the acceptance condition compared to suppression and control, which actually proves what we were looking for. So what can we conclude? Well, it seems that the body scan has a clear effect on attentional processes and on genital arousal, self-reported genital arousal. So it seems that attention is an important process here. So if we're working with body scans and sensed focus, we should learn people to focus more and attend more to sexual stimuli and to their bodily signals. We did not find an effect on genital arousal, which was rather unexpected because we expected that the body scan would increase attention and arousal to the bodily signals. We did find that acceptance is an important ingredient of mindfulness because it had an effect on all types of sexual arousal. And of course, we had no clinical samples, so we should replicate this with women with sexual problems. We had quite small effects, and it would be also interesting to focus more on individual differences to see whether there are differences in this mindfulness effect. But in any case, what we can conclude is that especially acceptance is an important ingredient of mindfulness, just accepting what you feel. And for me, it was surprising to see that there is so little research on the effect of acceptance and commitment therapy on sexual problems. There's a lot on mindfulness, but there's not much on acceptance and commitment therapy. So I think we should pursue this in the future. And what I also think is important is that we do more research on mindfulness-only interventions because, and try to compare this with mindfulness as part of CBT, for example, so that we can really focus on the mechanisms of change, because it could be that a full-blown mindfulness intervention will be more effective than just doing these single mindfulness interventions like a body scan or an acceptance instruction. So I think this is definitely a line of research that we should pursue in the future, because I think mindfulness is a promising treatment for sexual problems. Thank you.
Thank you.